Take 3.
All right, let's do this. Hello and welcome to this IBS Coach webinar. Today we're here with Lucy Whigham, Senior Dietitian at IBS Coach. Lucy has 10 years experience in the NHS and is a specialist in gut disorders, IBS and low FODMAP. I'm Lamal Asmal, Head of Food at IBS Coach. You'll notice the camera is focused on Lucy because she's the expert. In this webinar, we're going to cover the fundamentals of IBS, 5 myths of IBS, and how to treat IBS. So let's get to it. Lucy, what exactly is irritable bowel syndrome?
IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, is a collection of symptoms, really. So those symptoms include stomach pain, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, lots of wind, just general discomfort in your tummy area. And collectively they're known as irritable bowel syndrome.
Okay, so those are the symptoms. And do we know what causes IBS?
There's not one cause. At least in most people with IBS, there's not one single underlying factor. It's much more likely to be a combination of things, like a jigsaw puzzle of triggers. So some of the things that contribute to IBS are genetics, so it tends to run in families. The type of gut bacteria you have. Everyone has different levels of different species of bacteria, and some are helpful, some are associated with a higher amount of abdominal symptoms. Other things that contribute to stress, so like emotional stress or even physical stress, can contribute to IBS and make your gut more sensitive. But in the context of all these things, the underlying thing is this gut hypersensitivity. So we know that people that have IBS have a much more sensitive gut. So the nerves that line their gut are on high alert. So we've all got nerves kind of lining our gut, and they're all picking up signals all the time, speaking back to our brain. But people with irritable bowel syndrome, the signals are kind of a much more exaggerated response. So they're much more sensitive to what's going on inside the gut lumen. Okay.
So if someone is having these sort of symptoms, or how do they know that it's IBS?
I think a sensible move is to go and talk about it with your doctor, and your doctor will go through your symptoms and look at any red flag symptoms that you have. And red flag are just things that need a little bit more investigation. But on our IBS Coach website, we've got a symptom checker, and we'll ask you a bit about your history, the duration of symptoms, what type of symptoms you're experiencing, and then we give you a result whether you're likely to have IBS or not likely to have IBS, and you can take that result to your doctor and get it confirmed by them.
Okay, great. So that's on ibscoach.org, right?
Yeah.
Brilliant. And let's say you've just been diagnosed with IBS. Is IBS forever?
It's difficult to say. It is, unfortunately, for most people, a longer term condition, but it does tend to come and go. So there will be people that are really suffering kind of significant symptoms for a number of years, but then they notice that things improve, and then it might flare up again later in life, especially if you go through a stressful event. It tends to get better with age, so it's most common in your 20s and 30s, and then as you get past those decades, symptoms tend to get a bit more manageable.
Okay, but there's no magic pill or anything that we can take?
There's not a magic pill, there's not a cure as such. It's all about managing your symptoms, looking at what are the most troubling symptoms you have, and what steps you can take to manage them.
Okay, great. And how common is it? Is this something that's hiding under, what is it?
It's really common, actually. 1 in 7 of us have IBS. That's 800 million people in the world. And it means that there'll be a lot of people that you know that have IBS, but perhaps they don't talk about it. It's still a taboo topic to talk about your bowels. It's embarrassing for some people. But it is actually really common, so you're not alone, and we want to help you kind of cut through all the information out there and try and help you manage your symptoms.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So let's take a look at the top 5 myths of IBS. These are some that have been sent in to us. The first myth is, I've heard on forums that if you just don't eat gluten or dairy, you can cure your IBS. Is that true?
This is such a common myth or a common piece of advice. People are often advised to cut out all gluten and all dairy. For the majority of people, it won't be a gluten intolerance that is causing their IBS. They may find that gluten-containing foods, if they eat too many of them, can contribute to symptoms, but it's unlikely to be the underlying thing. And the same with dairy. Some people are more sensitive to dairy and can't tolerate large amounts of it. But again, a dairy intolerance or cutting out dairy completely is unlikely to be the answer to your IBS.
Okay. And that would probably go for things like plant-based diets, and you don't want to be cutting out everything just...
Exactly. It's so tempting to... you eat something, you get symptoms, it's very tempting to relate the two and be like, okay, that caused me symptoms, I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to cut that out. I'm going to totally rework my diet. But actually, that is a bit like shooting in the dark. Some people, they see an improvement going on to a plant-based diet. In my clinical experience, I actually find that people's symptoms get worse if they change to a totally plant-based diet, not because it's not good for you or it might have other health benefits. Lots of fruit and vegetables are good, but they can really contribute to IBS symptoms because of the types of fibres and sugars in those fruits and vegetables. So if you're looking at changing your diet, it's much better to go with a proven, scientifically proven dietary plan.
Okay, and we'll talk about that plan a little bit later. Let's get on to myth number 2, which is IBS leads to colon cancer or IBD. So what exactly is IBD, and does IBS cause this?
Yeah, so IBD and IBS sound so similar, but they're totally different. So IBD is inflammatory bowel disease, and that is an autoimmune condition where the lining of your gut becomes inflamed, and it often needs quite significant medical management. IBS is totally different, and there's no evidence at all that IBS leads to inflammatory bowel disease. So you might have heard of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Those are 2 types of IBD. But IBS also doesn't lead to colon cancer. Some people understandably get worried that when they're having a lot of diarrhea or a lot of pain, obviously looking out for colon cancer is in the forefront of our minds sometimes, but there is no evidence that the 2 are linked. And certainly when you go to your doctor or you do our symptom checker, we will, or your doctor will be looking for red flags to make sure that there's no indication of anything more sinister. Okay,
great. So myth number 3 is that IBS causes nutrient deficiency.
Yeah, it shouldn't do. So IBS doesn't at all interfere with the structure of your gut or how your gut absorbs foods. So even if you have really quite significant IBS, you'll still be absorbing all your vitamins and minerals and energy that you're eating. So you shouldn't experience anything like weight loss or vitamin deficiencies. The caveat is if you start really restricting your diet and cutting out food groups left, right and centre, yes, you then can be at risk of nutritional deficiency, but it's not the IBS per se that would be causing that.
Sure. Okay. And myth number 4 is that sugar triggers IBS symptoms.
Sugar's been so demonised, hasn't it? But in terms of IBS, sugar does not directly cause IBS. It's unlikely to worsen it, and that's because sugar, like normal sugar, the table sugar that you put in your tea, is just a single glucose molecule, and that's absorbed really high up in your gut, so it doesn't make it down to the colon where all the fermentation happens and where most people's IBS symptoms originate from. Okay, so sugar is not a trigger. Interesting. However, I'll just slide it in. If you are having a diet that's very high in sugar, it's likely that you're also eating a lot of processed foods and, might be having sugary drinks, which in general isn't going to do your gut health any good, and in general is probably going to make your gut more sensitive. Okay,
got it. So myth number 5, you need to eat healthily, or you just need to eat healthily to cure IBS.
Yeah, I wish it was that simple. people can have really unhealthy diets and still have symptoms of IBS, but people can have really healthy diets and suffer debilitating symptoms. And it's not down to the healthiness of what you're eating. Sometimes people try and make positive changes in their diet and start eating a lot more fruit and vegetables, which we know is really beneficial for your health. But they can, if you choose certain types of fruit and vegetables, make your IBS symptoms actually worse.
Right.
So no, going on a healthy diet is not going to eliminate your symptoms,
Sure.
unfortunately.
But it's always a good idea.
Exactly.
Okay, so actually on that subject of food and health, how do you treat IBS?
There's not one golden bullet of treatment, unfortunately. There's not one magic cure. But there are lots of things that you can do that have been scientifically proven to help your symptoms. And we're going to come on to the main crux of treatment, which is the low FODMAP diet, in a minute.
Sure.
But I'd really recommend people to look at the foundations first before they get to that stage. So we encourage people to look at these foundational things, which is kind of eating a balanced diet, regular meals, eating sensibly, so not rushing your food, not gobbling down.
Why would rushing your food cause symptoms?
So when you're eating quickly and you're not chewing properly, or if you're talking a lot while you're eating, something I'm guilty of, you're more likely to swallow more air, and the more gas that you put into your gut, the more bloating you'll have if you're susceptible to IBS type symptoms. Just generally kind of not eating kind of processed food, eating on the go is not going to be that great in terms of gut sensitivity.
Okay.
But the other things that are important if you're looking at that foundation is just things like sleep and exercise and stress management are really important in your gut health and trying to kind of dampen down that gut hypersensitivity. And then leading on from that, it's like kind of the second group of kind of ways to manage things is looking at CBT, which is cognitive behavioural therapy, or even things like hypnotherapy has been found to help manage gut symptoms. So once you've kind of got the foundations in place, you can move on to really looking at the nitty-gritty of your diet. And we know that there's a scientifically proven diet called the Low FODMAP diet, which helps about 75% of people that try it with their IBS symptoms, makes a significant difference to their symptoms. So the Low FODMAP diet is looking at a group of carbohydrates called fermentable carbohydrates. And the reason why they're fermentable is because they're not quite properly broken down in your gut, which is not a problem. Doesn't mean that your gut's malabsorbing. Everyone eats FODMAPs as part of their diet, and they're not bad for you.
Okay.
But if you've got a hypersensitive gut, they are fermented lower down your gut, and that fermentation causes excess gas, which can cause bloating and wind. The carbohydrates that are left in your gut can also pull in excess water, which can lead to like looser stools, more frequent stools. Some people go the other way though, because of all the kind of spasming with the gas. They can actually alternate with constipation. So we know that if you cut out FODMAPs from your diet, you're likely to have a good improvement. In fact, it's the best way we know of so far in terms of the scientific evidence to manage IBS. So that's where I direct most people that are really struggling with their symptoms. But the important thing is it's not a long-term diet. The first initial stages are 4 weeks where you cut out all of the fermentable carbohydrates.
Sure.
But then after that, you want to bring each of the families back in and look at your tolerance levels. So the aim of doing this is to get as much food freedom as possible, as much enjoyment. You know, food should be enjoyable and sociable. And so much of the difficulty when you're suffering with IBS is that it's very common to become afraid of eating or to not look forward to social occasions where you're all going to be eating together, sharing a meal with friends, and because you're so afraid of symptoms.
Sure.
Whereas if you can identify what your food triggers are by doing the low FODMAP diet, you're in control and you know what you can have, what you're going to avoid. So really it's about putting control back in your life in terms of knowing how to manage your symptoms.
Okay, and that's a plan. That's something. There's a process that people go through,
Yeah.
right?
It is quite a complicated diet, and there are lots of little caveats to it. So when you're kind of surfing the net, there are lots of different information out there. So I would encourage people to get support either through their doctor dietitian or through a program like ours, where it's simplified and there's a clear plan and a clear time frame.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for your expert advice, and I hope the conversation has been useful for our viewers. If you're suffering from digestive issues and need support, go to ibscoach.org and take Lucy's online digestive health assessment. IBS Coach creates